On the 31st of August 2022, Beyond the Wire was released. It came out of early access onto Steam, published by Offworld. They were famed for a fantastic franchise in Squad, one of the best modern military shooters of the time. Hundreds of players going up against each other with commanding ranks, vehicles, helicopters, various weapons, and some of the most brutal and bloody fighting ever. Later on, they picked up and published Postscriptum, a World War II variant of their most hardcore shooters. Along a similar line, Beyond the Wire soon released. Going back to the Great War, a 50 versus 50 multiplayer FPS, immersing you in some of the most desperate and brutal circumstances. 10 huge maps, 10 unique factions, era-specific tanks, and a brutal melee combat system. Beyond the Wire was set to be something absolutely fantastic. Now, whilst it released in August of 2022, this was not where it actually started. We have to go back all the way to late 2020. Yes, the COVID year. In fact, this was one of my very first reviews I ever left on Steam. One of the only games I've ever refunded. A great idea, but falls short in poor design and sloppy gameplay. Looks terrible, sounds horrendous, menu is a mess, and it's basically just a badly made Hell Let Loose. Seems a little bit harsh, but if I'm going to be honest, I wasn't the only one that thought that. You see, Beyond the Wire had a really promising launch and could have been one of the biggest World War I titles on the market. So what went wrong? 50 versus 50, that seems to be the sweet spot. It's where Postscriptum lies, it's where Squad has been for quite some time, and of course it is where one of the most successful Hell Let Loose sits at. It is a perfect amount of people to get nothing too huge, but also to really immerse yourself within the battlefield. Being able to have multiple squads with commanders, captains, medics, riflemen, anti-tank, so on and so forth, all communicating in different varied ways, whether it's through voice over IP or of course using orders within the game. And they really wanted to try and put this within the First World War. It worked so well in Hell Let Loose and Postscriptum, two Second World War games that had really taken off with these simulation tactics, so surely transporting it to the Great War wouldn't be all that tricky. The difference here is it replaced the large open maps with claustrophobic trenches, brutal, over-the-top action, and of course, varied maps. Whether you were playing as the Central faction or the Entente factions, they all had their own equipment, vehicles, and maps that were specific. So you'd be playing Germany versus France on certain trench maps, or you'd be picking up the Russians on the Eastern Front if you were going into that brutal theatre. There was artillery, there was anti-tank, there were snipers, and of course, there were commanders. It also had very era-specific tanks like the British Mark IV, the Canadian Armoured Autocar, the German Sturmpanzerwagen, and so many more, which was incredibly unique. You see, World War II games had covered tanks for quite some time, and even Squad in the modern day was using things like the Abrams, and tanks have been such a big part of warfare for the last 100 years. But the very first ones, especially things like the British Mark IV, have never really been represented before in gaming. So putting it in something like Beyond the Wire was a surefire way to create a unique experience. One of the more unique options was putting in some really cool melee combat. You have an arsenal of different weapons that you can use, from shovels to knives to bayonets, cudgels, and one of the most brutal games that has actually represented melee. You see, this was a big part of the Great War, so putting it in Beyond the Wire was almost a given. They had this cool parry system where you could almost have shovel fights in the trenches, which I don't think I've ever seen done before or ever recreated. But like many of these things, it was unique. But trying to ingest my daily water intake through my eyeballs is unique, yet it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. And I think that was the main problem with Beyond the Wire. There is no one else in this game at all whatsoever. I think there's 100 bots in here, but that's all there is. As you can see, it's just completely... What the... There's just people on fire walking around. Despite its incredibly immersive gameplay, there were some glaring issues upon release. You see, we can look to now why the player base has fallen off and why there is nothing there, but nobody really analyzes its actual issues. And that takes me back to my first review that I left for it. It did look terrible for a game coming out in 2020. Graphically, it just wasn't really up to point. And one of the biggest arguments is that graphics doesn't matter. And on the most part, I would agree. But if there's huge pop-in, glitching textures that just don't work, especially in a game that really has to utilize cover, hiding in trenches and having bugs seeing through those trenches, or trying to hop over objects and not being able to move because the meshes haven't quite been fixed, that is when the visuals can affect gameplay. The sound design was really strange for me, since I've seen many people compliment it, adding to its immersion. And one of the biggest things for a World War I game is to bring in this immersive nature, and sound design is a core of that. But it just didn't sound quite right, as if not enough time had been spent on it. The cracks as bullets went over had been panned in different directions that didn't quite fit to where shots were coming from. Something incredibly important for a simulation shooter is being able to not just visually spot enemies, but also audibly work out where they are, give commanders to your other squad members, and move accordingly. And this just wasn't possible within the game. And this brings me on to the main issue with Beyond the Wire: the disconnect between intention and execution. And no, look, I'm not talking about execution Nuremberg Trials mode, but the execution of the way the game was made. You see, setting something within World War I is beautiful on the surface. It has been very underrepresented, and I'd love to see more of it, especially in this gaming space. A World War I hardcore shooter from the front of it seems like the perfect idea. Bringing that post-scriptum Hell Let Loose mechanics into the Great War, where players sit behind trenches, up on the firing steps, and taking orders. See, Verdun did something kind of similar. It was a pretty hardcore shooter, you'd die in one hit, if that. And of course, there was things like mustard gas artilleries commanding roles. So why was that more successful than even Beyond the Wire? Well, they had a very specific game mode. It was attack and defend. A whistle would go off and you'd have to go over the trenches, while one team sits in their trenches. In fact, it was almost like putting orders in through the game mechanics. But Beyond the Wire didn't have that. People were running around doing whatever they pleased, playing it like Hell Let Loose or Postscriptum, but that didn't quite fit with the World War I aesthetic. When you're fighting within trenches, you have to hold your ground, wait for the attack before you can make your own, and when that attack comes, you have to charge as a whole. But without having game-forced mechanics to make sure everybody is following that pattern like Verdun did, well, it just didn't seem to fit. Everybody running around like headless chickens with bolt-action rifles, meaning that the balance was all off. You see, Verdun worked very well because everybody had to defend and attack when they were told to. Otherwise, the game would at least tell you off a little bit. This meant that when there was a charge over the trenches, your whole team would be doing it at once. Because that never happened in Beyond the Wire, things like snipers became incredibly overpowered. Being able to sit in the back and take pot shots at pretty much anybody, when every other gun was bolt action with no scope, having a gun that did have a scope was almost like a cheat code. This meant that gameplay for anybody that wasn't a recon or sniper squad was incredibly infuriating. And what happens when you're trying to launch a new game to a new audience and you piss them off within the first few minutes? Well, they leave, and in worst case scenario, they refund. Upon its October early access release, 2,300 players hopped into the game. Incredible? Not quite, but usable, especially for 50 versus 50. You can get, over 23 full servers. Look, my maths is incredible, you don't have to leave a comment. Yet, almost instantly, the player base declined. And whilst a lot of people seem to have some fond memories and a soft spot for Beyond the Wire, it seems that the stats don't lie. October 2020 was in the launch, and by November, we'd already dropped to a quarter of its initial launch number. Then, within the next couple months, we were down to below 100 players. Then, in May of 2021, the player numbers spiked again. What could it be? Well, it was a free weekend. 1,700 players hopping onto the server, and as soon as that weekend was up, back to 200. What does this tell us? Well, essentially it means that nobody likes the game enough to buy it. It didn't even bring the players up more than it was before that free weekend. So it's almost baffling that nobody playing the game for free decided, hey, yeah, I'd pick this up and play it more, judging by the sheer amount of drop-off. Then there were a few little spikes as time went on. It was put in the Humble Bundle, which was nice. And we got the Steam release on the 31st of August 2022. But even that full release, after 2 years of early access, the player numbers went up to no more than 300 concurrents on a full release of a multiplayer-only game. That is shocking. Now, it wasn't over yet. There were a few updates and additions. Patches came in, but that was pretty much it. No huge content drops, and anything that was just wasn't enough to make a dent in the community. There wasn't a game that people really loved, and there wasn't new content coming out. Games can redeem themselves over time if a developer puts effort, brings out content, and fixes all the issues. then they can start to rise up again. We've seen that more recently with a game like Squad 44. Yet the developers for Beyond the Wire didn't do that because there wasn't really a need to. There were no players in their game. So any content that they did bring out wasn't going to make an impact. It wasn't bringing players back. And because they'd made that decision, well, it was doomed to failure. When you're caught in that cycle of not enough players to warrant more development time, not enough content being brought out to bring in more players, it's a downhill spiral that needs a savior. In fact, now, Beyond the Wire is still on Steam and it can still be purchased, which for me is absolutely horrendous. And that's where it was left. Beyond the Wire, a dead game, with nobody playing it. You can jump on with a few bots, but that's about it. In fact, the only servers that are there are the few community servers, and they're slowly being taken down as well. Official server support was pulled, yet it is still on Steam. And that brings me on to where the game is now. I think it is awful that this game can still be purchased if you wanted to, because someone could come along and see a game that looks awesome and fills a niche that nobody has quite done yet, buy it, and then be left alone. Walking around with just bots. Of course, Steam now has the refund policy, but the fact that there's a chance that someone can still purchase this game, but the developers have actively pulled their servers from it, is something that needs to change. So, Redstone Interactive, please take the game down, unless there's another option. You see, I made a video on the redemption of Beyond the Wire, and I don't think it's completely out of the question, because whilst this has been a fairly negative video on the title, I don't think it's all bad. There is a good call there, and there is a call for World War I games. The World War I game series, Verdun, Tannenberg, and Isonzo, have done a good job of keeping up this genre or this period time era for quite some time, and nobody has really challenged them for it. But if anyone can, it's Offworld. Recently, the publisher that made Squad bought Postscriptum, changed it into Squad 44, and revived what was once a dead World War II shooter. And that could happen with Beyond the Wire. With the resources and money behind it, and a little bit more love put back into it, this cycle can start going back up. With the developers back on board, bringing out updates and content, the players will start to come back in, therefore warranting more time to be put into the World War I title. And that is what I'd love to see, because whilst Beyond the Wire is completely dead, in fact, it is one of the most disastrous stories of a first-person shooter that I've ever seen, losing its player base within the first month. Especially with such a huge publisher behind it, it was almost baffling to me. Maybe it was released at the wrong time and just didn't quite have the content that people wanted at that point. Maybe the 2 years between early access and its final release was just too much space for it to make a real impact. But right now, that doesn't seem possible. What little gameplay there is left is laggy. It's buggy and filled with bots that have no idea which way the door is. That is the experience you can get from Beyond the Wire. So something needs to happen, or if it has finally and truly been left by Redstone Interactive, it needs to be pulled off Steam, because there is no question that the game has gone.